Hey everybody, Brendan here. Welcome back to another tournament game analysis video. Today we're going to be looking at the final game from the January Excelsior Open. I was playing against Lafon, and this was just a kind of a crazy game. It was an e4 opening, but it kind of transposed into a d4 opening. We'll have to see. All right, so I ended up playing the move e4. My opponent played the move c5. Knight f3, natural, knight c6, and bishop to b5. As if you've seen any of my previous tournament games, you would know that the Rossalimo is something I've switched to just because it kind of leaves the position, at least it feels a little bit less theory dense, as in like you can kind of make your way through and kind of just guess a little bit more. Like it's more positional. Like with d4 openings, whenever you're playing d4 against, get really hectic, and I wanted to avoid that, and I want to avoid that. So bishop b5 was my choice. So we see e6, bishop takes on c6, b takes e6, and I end up playing d3 here. Now we see knight to e7, and there's actually a pretty good move here that I didn't end up going for, but it's worth a shot, is h4. And the idea of h4 is usually when you play knight e7, your idea is knight g6, just full send. Like that's what you want to do, and h4 is pretty much just trying to avoid that. If you play knight g6 now, then I'll play h5, and now your knight's kind of just on a weird circuit. Do you want to bring it back and bring it to f6 at some point? That seems pretty slow. Otherwise, where does it go? Or do you want to play h5 and weaken this g5 square, the dark square there? So I ended up, unfortunately, but I should have. I ended up castling instead. And now after knight g6, h4 is not really possible. There is a kind of a way to do it here where you could play g3 and then h4, but g3 and then h4 does have consequences. It's a little bit slower, and maybe this g3 move is not a move you actually wanted to play. So those are things definitely to consider. Realistically, I think the move it looks visually okay, but it's just never played, so it's hard to really say it's more credible than just a visual thing. Anyways, so I played knight b to d2. It's just knight b d2. Sometimes it's just hard to say. It's like a tongue twister. And my opponent ended up playing e5, which I think is quite interesting. And the idea here is they're just trying to get more of the center. They're going to be playing d5 and maybe even d4 at some point. And we can kind of see what type of not because of the d-pawn, but actually because of the king side. If you have any guesses as to what it may be, feel free to comment them and see if you're right later on. All right, so I end up playing b3 here, which is kind of not really the right approach. Instead, c3 is a little bit better, and I actually had a kind of similar approach that I did play in a game. I forget their name, but it was in the Quebec Open, where I ended up playing the c3 d4 because, well, I lost the bishop pair because it was this type of Rossalimo, and I wasn't sure how to continue, so I just tried to open things up when it looked like I was slightly better developed. And turns out that was actually the right approach here as well. So d6, d4, c takes, and c takes. If I play into a position like this, it's surprisingly not so bad. Like, their structure isn't amazing or anything, away from the advantage of any bishop pair. So could have done that. Instead, b3 was played, and this is kind of a normal move in some forms of the Sicilian, specifically the Rossalimo, where you put this bishop on b2. But I don't think it quite works out the same here when they have the d-pawn. It's usually played under very specific circumstances, and this just kind of wasn't the best one. Because again, c3 and d4 opening things up when they haven't really developed as much is much more important here. So d6, I ended up playing knight c4, not really to keep it there, more so to reroute it to e3. Bishop to e7, c3, also preparing a potential d4. Castles, knight to e3, and my opponent made a mistake here with knight to h4. I think this is just objectively a mistake. Instead, if they just continue on with rook e8 and keeping the pressure, something similar as I did in the game, with bishop e2 and even rook e1, it's unlikely I'm going to be playing f4 because of this knight on g6. Bishop to f8. d4 is actually the top move, and the reason why is because you just have enough, like slightly enough compensation, but also not. Like, it's a rough position, but it's less clear than you'd think. You think black is just doing amazing here. And no, you're not winning a piece, by the way, from queen c3. Just to make that clear, there's always bishop to f8. But and like there might even be d4 there, but not important. That is not what I was trying to discuss. The more important thing here is, yeah, like surprisingly these pieces are just like slightly awkward. Like it's not working out amazingly for black quite yet. So despite them having an extra pawn, yeah, white is at least surviving for now. If it's possible they can survive like for a long time, then maybe things will kind of even out. But of course, black should likely have a slight advantage here. Anyway, so they played knight to h4 instead. That was just a really long line, but that was kind of a sample line of ideas that I was planning to do in the game. So knight takes h4, bishop takes h4, bishop to b2, and the idea of this is just to help prepare d4 and get the bishop on the long diagonal. This is actually an idea I had because I was relating this to the versions of, I believe it's like the Steinitz and the Roy Lopez. So if I just go back all the way, sometimes you'll see these positions: knight c6, bishop to b5, d6, d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3. And this like might seem a little abstract, but I thought it would have been something useful for me to just take note of. So we enter a position like this. Let's just say takes, everything. What do you play in this position? And I think there's actually potentially a best move here. I could be wrong. Maybe it's a slightly different position. But usually in these positions, surprisingly, I saw this in a Johann Helston book. One of the best options is actually to play b3. It's very unintuitive because you'd think you want to develop your bishop on this diagonal. It's already able to develop. But it's actually fine to waste a move or two. It's not even wasting it. It's actually just utilizing the fact that if you take an extra tempi or two to long diagonal, it can create a lot more problems. So for example, rook e8, bishop to b2, and let's just say a move like a6, moves like knight to d5 are all of a sudden quite annoying to deal with because we're threatening, for example, to take the bishop. Do they really want to play bishop to d8? And kind of it looks like that's actually wasting time. They definitely can't take because of mate on g7. And one of the big things that they were going to do next is, of course, play bishop to f8. So, yeah, this is a very nice way to develop. The bishop does belong here. And that's kind of what my idea was here, is it just kind of, it had some weird similarities, I felt, to that position, mainly because it's an e4, e5 position. There's a pawn on d6. And I was preparing d4 anyways to open this diagonal up. It's abstract, but this is just how I saw the position at the time. Not saying this is correct. Objectively, it's not so amazing anyways. But all right, g6. Now I played c4 instead, which seems counterintuitive because I wanted to play d4. But if I play d4 now, well, the e4 pawn was not really well defended, so that was kind of a concern of mine. Now, after c4, we see bishop to g5. I played rook a to e1. This is a very intentional move. I want to play bishop c1 at some point, but I don't want to play it when the rook would be stuck on a1. I thought it would be more useful over here on the king side because I am actually expecting this to turn into some sort of King's Indian defense with f5, f4, g5, g4. And the problem with it is it's harder to see the counterplay. And that's kind of why I played c4, is I'm trying to get moves like a3 and b4 in eventually, which is probably my best source of counterplay. So yeah, I'm not really too comfortable with my position already, though objectively I'm not doing so badly here. Bishop to e6, knight to d1, f5, and this is actually a blunder, knight to c3. So I have to be a lot more proactive here. I have to take on f5. From a principled perspective, this move makes absolutely no sense. And the reason why is because you are initiating pawn trades in a way where it looks like it does anything but benefiting you. And what I mean by that is when your opponents have the bishop pair, normally you don't want to open up the position because they have the bishop pair. If the position opens up more, the bishops kind of increase in their strength. But the thing is, they actually do take on some kingside weaknesses, which originally I just thought was a problem for me. They're opening up lines on the king side, but it turns out to be a bit more double-edged than that. So for example, g takes f5, the move I would have played if I was playing black. Let's just say king h1, very natural move. And king h8 does not work because f4 actually is just winning on the spot here because of this long diagonal. That is important to point out, that this bishop on the long diagonal actually does serve a purpose at this point. So bishop to f7 is a bit more of a natural move, just aligning themselves with the queen. And now g3. And the idea of g3, it looks like, okay, yeah, maybe play f4, but there's also some alignment issues. We have to move our queen first. Turns out you don't. If you just play f4 immediately, you're playing mainly against this bishop on g6. E takes f4, and yeah, you just play queen f3. And you're totally okay with even giving up this pawn on f4 altogether, letting them take on. And you could take on g3. More precise is taking on c6 first, and then taking on g3. But this is just... it's just a lot of complications, and it turns out at the end of the day that white's not doing that badly because this bishop on the long diagonal does give quite a bit of compensation there. So it's really nice to point out. And it's not easy for them to just really like challenge the diagonal in any way. Bishop f6 would lose a piece to bishop takes f6, as the rook would be hanging in the corner. So going all the way back here, knight to c3 is just a mistake because now it does allow f4, and f4 I was expecting because it looks like a King's Indian type of game now, but I was hoping that because they have two bishops, I have a knight, if things are at least a little bit closed, even though this is kind of a very bad version of me, that's probably where I can get my chances. I already thought I was worse before I took on or before I even considered taking on f5 or just allowing f4, but again, I should have gone with that instead there. So I played f3. I thought it was necessary. Bishop to h4, rook back to a1 now, with ideas of a3 and b4. h5, knight to d1, g5 now, bishop to c3, and my idea is to just trade off this dark square bishop, because one big problem that can occur is if they get a pawn to g3 in any way, and I have a bunch of dark square weaknesses. I was just really scared of that, so I thought if I could trade those two pieces off, that might actually help me. G4, bishop to e1, and they do get in g3. So when you see this position with h3, you should immediately recognize white is lost. Bad position, because eventually what they're going to do is they're going to put their queen here, and they're just going to take this pawn with their bishop, sacrifice a full piece, and by sacrificing a full piece, they're just going to rip open the king side, and there's just nothing to do about it. Like, I can try to create counterplay on the queen side, but it's just too slow. With this pawn structure the way it is, it's actually amazingly placed for them. So queen to d7, b4, have to be as proactive as possible. C takes b4, bishop takes b4 and c5. I go bishop to d2 here. just to keep it kind of on a little bit on both sides. If I go like a3, I don't know if it's going to get hit by queen a4 or anything. Bishop d2 just felt like the safest option, keeping the rooks connected as well, because again, the only plan I got now is to try to create some counterplay. King f7, and you can clearly see what their idea is here. They're trying to bring over on the g file, and yeah, the king just serves no purpose on g8 anymore. Knight to c3, rook to h8, which I'm not a huge fan of. I think rook to g8 is just a better move, right? Just going there, or even taking on h3 at this point looks quite strong. But they play rook h8. I play rook f to b1. And I would rather play the rook on f to b1 rather than the a rook, just because it gives my king a little bit more space to move around. Of course, not those squares, but it's kind of like it's stuck right now, right? So if it has one extra square, I consider that to be quite nice. And now my opponent blunders with bishop to g5. Their whole attack has been leading up to taking on h3, and bishop g5 is antithetical to taking on h3. So let's see why. If they take on h3 right, what do you think is the move here to get a winning advantage? It might not be what you're thinking. So you might think, okay, let's just take this pawn, right? And yeah, that does look nice, but there's actually a very, very difficult move to deal with. And the second you see it, you realize the game is over. It's g2. After the move pawn to g2, what is there to be done? I can't take the pawn in any way without losing either my king or my queen. And they're going to be taking on h3 and playing queen h1 with mate next. So that is very bad. And yeah, there's just nothing to be done here. So this would have just been the end of the game. But bishop g5 closes up the g file and doesn't take on h3. So they're wasting time here. And luckily, I had just enough time to make some counterplay. So I play rook b3. They took on h3 now. Queen takes h3. I play rook b7 check. King g6. Doubling up on the only open file in the entire board. Queen to e6. Knight to d5. Again, suddenly all of my pieces are just kind of finding good squares all of a sudden, which is really nice. My opponent ends up continuing to go for the attack, but it's just a bit too slow. Now I can play knight to c7. They play queen c8. I take their rook in the corner. And here I play rook to d7, which wasn't totally necessary. There is this absolutely bonkers move d4. But the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what about h3? Turns out after you take on e5 and play something like bishop c3, there's not really much you can do with these pawns. It's very weird. So g2 is kind of the scarier of the two. If you play h2, then of course there's not really as much of a fear because the light squares are all covered, right? But yeah, if they play g2, ever try playing h2 after, you can take this g2 pawn and the h1 square is sufficiently covered by the b1 rook and the king on g2. So there's just nothing. And yeah, you could just follow up with queen to b2 and white's just winning because we are up a rook at the end of the day. So instead, rook to d7 was played. Queen to c6. Rook b to b7. Again, trying to create as much pressure as I possibly can here. Bishop to f6. And I ended up going for repetition here with rook b to c7. And we'll see that in just a moment. But rook b c7 is not necessary. There's actually a really cool move here. And I considered things in the game like bishop takes on f4. And I thought that might give me enough counterplay. But there's something else that's really strong and really strange, but kind of with a similar idea. And that's bishop to e1. So the only threat possible is some form of like h3, h2, g2, and trying to push one of these pawns through, right? If one of those pawns do promote, I would be lost. My king is right there. It would be under attack, and there's just no good way to defend that position. Plus they would, gain material because they'd be promoting. But after h3, which is the move you'd want to play, unfortunately there's bishop takes g3. And if there's bishop takes g3, there's nothing else for black to do here. This is just lost because we're up a rook, and eventually we can start untangling things. But this motif of having bishop takes g3 is just such a big deal. Again, if you don't take it, then we just took that pawn. There's no more threats against white's king. But if you do take it, oh boy. Now there's f4, and black is just lost. Either f5 check is coming or queen g4 check is coming. There's no good way to, and white would be winning. Unfortunately, I did not play that. This is a very, very complicated position, as you can see. It's very easy just to see white messing up and allowing some sort of huge counterplay. The second you see that pawn get to h3, you're immediately thinking like, this is really, really bad. But sometimes the threat is stronger than the execution, and that was a huge lesson here. So rook bc7, rook b7, and I don't know if I offered the draw or my opponent did, but we mutually agreed to one at this point. And I think we were both happy with that result. I was dead lost, and then I was completely winning. So, you know, when both sides are losing at some point and it ends in a draw, it's not the worst result in the world. Of course, I did lose some rating from this because I was higher rated here, but it was a good turn. I believe gaining a decent amount of rating from this event, which was really nice. And that kind of covers it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next event. All right, bye-bye.